Hello, my name is Richard B. Frank, and I'm here today to talk about John F. Kennedy and the PT-109 and try to separate a little bit of fact from fiction. I want to thank the National World War II Memorial for giving me this opportunity to speak. We have a lot to talk about today. I'm going to do a little background with respect to Kennedy, the PT-109, the area that this is going to take place in, and then move into what actually happened, and then we'll move on from there to questions. Kennedy was the son of Joseph P. Kennedy, who was an Irishman who became very wealthy and raised a very large family, as just about everyone knows now. In addition to the fact that it was a very wealthy family, Kennedy and his brothers and sisters spent a great deal of time on the water, both swimming and boating, which made him very well qualified for service in the U.S. Navy. He went to Harvard, graduated from there, and in his last year at Harvard, he wrote a thesis which became a book called Why England Slept, which addressed why England had been slow to wake up to the threat posed by Hitler. Now, as it became clear that the U.S. was cruising down towards World War II and intervention in that war, Kennedy volunteered to enlist in the U.S. Navy, and he entered active duty on September 25th, 1941. He had no officer training before he reported for duty, and he was immediately assigned to the Office of Naval Intelligence in Washington. And his job there was to be an editor of a secret-level newsletter which were circulated to top officials in the U.S. Navy, both the civilians and the uniformed members, and it included all sources of intelligence except code breaking. There was some code breaking material they received, but it was disguised as to where it came from. So this was an extremely sensitive job that he was performing. Meanwhile, in his spare time, he was conducting an affair with this woman named Inga Arvad, and a very attractive woman, and it was a very active affair. The problem was, it turned out that she was suspected of being a Nazi spy. Now, this was not true, but obviously there was something wrong with the picture of him working on secret-level material for the Navy Department and conducting an affair with a potential Nazi spy. So immediately after Pearl Harbor, you found that Kennedy was no longer in Washington, D.C. He'd been transferred to South Carolina, where he was doing sort of a public relations act. Both Kennedy and his very influential father worked very assiduously to get him out of that job and out to the combat area. He deserves enormous credit for that. He was using his pull not to get out of combat, but to get into combat. He went to Northwestern University, where he actually did an officer training program, this 90-day wonder program, which gave him orientation as to the duties and responsibilities and the nature of naval service. He did that from July to September 1942. He did very well at that. He also had decided that he wanted to serve in PT boats, which had a very glamorous aura about them at that time. They were also attractive to someone like Kennedy and other junior officers because it gave an opportunity for early command of a PT boat, your own ship, and it was much less formal than the mainstream of the Navy. He went to the PT boat training center at Melville, Rhode Island, and graduated from there in October 1942. He did extremely well in that. In fact, he did so well that he was designated to stay behind and remain as an instructor. Once again, he used all the pull he had and his father had to get him orders to get out to the South Pacific. And he arrived there on April 7th, 1943. He came in on a landing ship tank off the island of Guadalcanal just in time for one of the biggest Japanese air raids that had ever taken place in the South Pacific. His LST was, in fact, the target of some of the Japanese planes and was near missed. When he got ashore as a PT boat sailor, he was assigned to Motor Torpedo Squadron number 2 and transferred to their main base, which at that time was a place called Rendova Island in the middle of the Solomons. And that's where he would become the commander of PT-109. Now, at that time, the PT boat war, to the general public of the U.S. and to most of the men who volunteered to serve in it, was very, very glamorous. It had a great reputation for great daring, courage, and great success. The professional Navy, however, had a very different view of PT boat service. They thought it was what they called the hooligan Navy. It was ill-disciplined, and it had been pretty ineffective from the standpoint of professional naval officers. The reality was that the PT boats had actually had their ups and downs. They'd had some spectacular successes and spectacular failures. It was hard duty. The living conditions were very poor. There was the constant drudgery of the maintenance of the PT boats, which required a great deal of time and attention. And there was the constant fatigue. PT boats normally operated at night, continuously on patrols, so you were always very fatigued and sleepless. In my due diligence, I went to the National Archives. There are about 3 photographs we can identify that are of PT-109. They're all in a series when the PT-109 had been loaded aboard a Liberty ship to be transported out to the South Pacific. And from this series of photographs, we're able to identify that this is, in fact, the PT-109 being loaded aboard the starboard forward side of this Liberty ship. This is a shot of her sister ship, PT-107, which was identical in all respects to the PT-109. It gives you some idea of what a PT boat looked like when it was at sea, at speed. Now let's talk about the theater. First of all, this is the Pacific Ocean area as it was in 1943. You see that the Japanese Empire is marked by everything in red, and then that red line stretching well across the Pacific. The Japanese had created from December 1941 one of the great empires in history. It had no fewer than 516 million people in it. This is actually greater than the number of people who were within the German Empire, its apogee, which was about 360 million people. The blue arrow indicates where the Solomon Islands are, which is where the Americans had launched their first offensive of the war at Guadalcanal in August 1942. By the time that Kennedy arrives, operations now focused in the Central Solomons. Here you see the Central Solomon Islands. If you look carefully at this map, if you look at the center and just a little bit below that, you'll see an island which is almost circular in shape. That's Kolombangara. That's the focal point of the episode we're going to be talking about. And the main action occurs off the southwestern side of that. If you look a little bit to the southeast and down from that, you see Rendova Island, and that's where the main PT boat base was, which is where Kennedy's PT-109 was stationed at the time of the actions we're going to talk about. Now let's talk a little bit about the PT-109. It was made by the Electric Boat Company, or ELCO Company. It was the favored version of the PT boat used by the U.S. Navy in World War II. There were 326 of these eventually produced. The next largest number were made by the Higgins Boat Company, Andrew Higgins, who was famous for the landing craft that he developed. There were about 198 of those. The Elcos were used worldwide. The 109 was supposedly a very fast motor torpedo boat, but the reality was that if the boat had been in the water for a long time, the hull tended to absorb water. It also had been in the South Pacific, accrued a lot of marine growth. Instead of the top speed of over 40 knots, it was lucky to make 40 knots at this time due to those combinations of factors. And also the engines were very temperamental. If they got out of tuning, it frequently would cut into the power available. Now, the boat weighed 56 tons. The main armament were 4 21-inch torpedo tubes. You see the tubes there on port and starboard, just aft. The red star indicates the conning position, which is where the skipper of the PT boat would be located during battle stations. He physically actually controlled the steering of the boat. He had the helm immediately in front of him. He had just to his right front the throttles controlling the power that was available to the boat. And he totally conned the boat as his part of his duties or whatever here. There were also armament that included 4 50 caliber machine guns, which were in 2 twin mounts, one of which is located, as you look at the diagram, just below where Kennedy was stationed, and one is just aft of where Kennedy is stationed. And there was also a 20 millimeter Oerlikon anti-aircraft gun, which was at the stern of the 109. Now the 109 was specially fitted with an Army 37 millimeter anti-tank gun. This was designed to deal with the fact that they were frequently encountering what American sailors called barges. They were actually Japanese landing craft that were used for logistical purposes in the Solomon Islands, mostly at night. And they'd rigged up that 37 millimeter gun to deal with barges. At the time of the episode we're going to talk about, the crew of the PT-109 included 3 officers and enlisted men. One of the officers was a supernumerary, a fellow named George Barney Ross, who just decided on a lark to go along on this particular mission. Kennedy was the skipper of the boat. His executive officer was an ensign named Leonard Thom. who will play an important role in the events that follow. Now, the basic episode that we're involved in is this night action that occurred during the night of the 1st to 2nd August 1943. We had radio intelligence alert that the Japanese were making a run of what the Americans called the Tokyo Express. Now, in that era, most Americans did long distance or even short distance travel primarily by trains. The crack trains, the ones that ran on time, on schedule at high speed, were called express trains. And the Americans referred to these night runs of Japanese destroyers through the Solomons, particularly down to Guadalcanal, as the Tokyo Express, making the analogy to the railroad system. For this particular mission this night, there were 4 Japanese destroyers involved. One was the Amagiri. The Japanese named their destroyers poetically after weather phenomena, and the name of Amagiri translates roughly as mist in the heavens or heavenly mist, which ironically had some connection to what would happen this night. The other 3 destroyers were the Arashi, the Hagakazi, and the Shiguri. And they were altogether carrying about 900 Japanese troops. They were hauling these troops to the main Japanese base on the island of Kalambagara at a place called Villa. With forewarning of the approach of the Japanese destroyers, a major effort was made by the available PT boats at the Rondova base, and they mustered a total of 14 of these PT boats. The problem was that only 4 of them had radar equipment, and at night in the Solomons, if you didn't have radar, your situational awareness, as we now call it, would be very limited. It'd be visual sighting only, which was extremely limited in its capacity to pick up anything at night other than at very close range. The PT boats were divided, the 14 boats were divided into 4 sections. Each section was headed by a PT boat that had radar. Kennedy's section was called Division B. It involved a PT 159, which had radar, which was partnered with the 157, and the second section of this division was the 109 and the 162. They got on station, which was in Blackett Strait, which was to the southwest of Kalambagara, like I explained. The Japanese destroyers came roaring down from their main base at Rabaul and passed through the area. During that pass-through, the 159, which had radar, and its partner identified the Japanese and attacked, firing torpedoes, and then they withdrew. The 109 and the 162 didn't really understand what was happening. It had no situational awareness and became lost and missed any encounter with the Japanese destroyers that had come through. They then reformed in a rough column. It was the 109 was leading under Kennedy. It was followed by the 162 boat and the 169 boat. They were waiting in Blackett Strait for the return of the Japanese destroyers. Now, what happened next is a matter of some considerable controversy. It involves several factors, the first of which was that what was the state of the watch on the PT-109? Well, there were 13 Americans aboard the 109, one of whom, a fellow named Mac Mahone, who was the motor machinist mate who ran the engines. He was down in the engine room. He, of course, had no observational opportunity from inside the hull. Of the other 12 individuals who were on the crew of the 109 that night, at least 3, possibly 4, were off duty, were not on watch when the Amagiri approached. Why this was so remains a matter of mystery, since other boats were operating with everyone on watch. The second factor was that because of the circumstances that the 109 had operated in, the lookout had to be maintained not only horizontally towards any possible surface ship approaching, but also vertically. The Japanese employed what they called float planes, which were biplane aircraft that carried small bombs, which were sent out specifically to hunt PT boats. Only a couple weeks before, the 109 had been attacked by one such aircraft, had been near missed. 2 of the crew members had been wounded and were evacuated and replaced by other crew members. So everyone who was aboard the 109 that night knew that they needed to maintain a lookout not only horizontally but vertically. The other problem was, before the encounter with the Amagiri, was that Kennedy was operating with only one of the 3 engines of the 109 engaged, and it was muffled, producing low power. The muffling was designed to decrease the amount of sound signature that the PT-109 was making, and also to enable them to hear a potential float plane floating overhead. The This combination of circumstances led to the fact that the Amagiri approached very close. Now, the 162 boat and the 169 boat, who were trailing the 109 boat, both claimed that they saw the Amagiri closing in on the 109 before the 109 reacted. Now, there's a wild card in this story that's not been properly covered before. In the Solomons at night, because of the differential cooling of land and water, it was a very frequent phenomena that cloud banks of mist, some of which could be so dense that you couldn't see through them, would form on the shore of the island and then drift out to sea. In my view, it's entirely possible to explain why the Amagiri became so close to the 109 by the fact that one of these cloud banks was on the sight line between the 109 and the Amagiri. It was not on the sight line between the 162 boat and the 169 boat and the Amagiri. In any event, when the Amagiri was sighted, it was sighted by a man who was stationed in the 50 caliber twin mount, which was immediately below where you're seeing the star where Kennedy is standing, conning the 109, Harold Marney. And he called out a sighting of the Amagiri closing in. The time that between the sighting and when Amagiri rammed the 109 is believed to have been as short as 10 seconds. Kennedy reported that as soon as he received the alert that the Amagiri was coming, he attempted to maneuver the 109 to turn and to attempt a torpedo attack. However, the Amagiri was so close and so fast that it rammed the 109. Now, contrary to many accounts that were given as to what had happened, the Amagiri did not cut the 109 in two. It, in fact, sliced down the starboard side, as you see the red arrow marking how the Amagiri just simply sliced open the hull of the 109 from somewhere after the bow, cutting down through the hull. Two crew members on the PT-109, Harold Marney, who was in that 50 caliber mount, and Kirksey, who was laying on the deck on the aft starboard side, were never seen again after the 109 was rammed by the Amagiri and were lost. Kennedy had the Amagiri slicing through the 109 only a few feet away from where he's standing. Directly behind and below where Kennedy was were the fuel tanks of the 109, which had a capacity of 3,000 gallons of high-octane gasoline, but had probably by this point about 2,000 gallons. The Amagiri sliced into those fuel tanks, but very, very fortunately for Kennedy and the rest of the crew on the 109, most of the fuel was flung up on the Amagiri and flung out to the starboard side where it ignited on the surface of the water and into a fireball. Had the fuel enveloped the 109 and ignited, it probably would have incinerated the entire crew of the 109. It's also noteworthy and not usually noted in this that Kennedy, in his attempt to turn the 109, had swung the bow around. If he had managed to swing the bow around by as much as maybe another 10 or 15 degrees, it's likely that the Amagiri would have almost head-on collided with the 109 and sliced down the center, which almost certainly would have killed Kennedy from the impact, and not to mention the fact that it probably would have ignited the fuel tanks and incinerated Kennedy and anybody else who were missed from being crushed by the bow of the racing Amagiri. Now, immediately after the ramming, most of the crew members aboard the 109 were tossed off the ship and were very lucky that, again, that the fuel did not envelop them. The 109 sank. The engines, of course, were the heaviest part of the boat, and they pulled the stern under. So it's the forward part of the bow, which was watertight, which was sticking out of the water. Over the next next hour or so, the scattered survivors made their way back towards the 109. Kennedy, in particular, swam out and recovered the machinist mate, who had a miraculous escape from the engine compartment of the 109. He was basically passed under the hull of the Amagiri and was apparently narrowly missed by the propellers. He was badly burned. He was drifting, and Kennedy went out, grabbed him, and pulled him in. And several of the crew members pulled into the hulk of the 109, which was still floating at that time. I should also note that the 109 had been equipped with a 37mm anti-tank gun for anti-barge use, and fortuitously a large piece of wood, which was used to anchor the anti-tank gun, drifted free and was going to be extremely providential to the survivors of the 109. When the 109 was sunk, there was a fellow named A. Reginald Evans and another fellow named Benjamin Nash, who were coast watchers. This was an organization that had been set up by the Australians And they were stationed at lookout points throughout the Solomons, and they monitored Japanese activities. They had teleradios that permitted them to report these things. Evans and Nash were up on Kolombangara at a high vantage point and actually saw the fireball that represented where the 109 was rammed by Amagiri at about 0227 a.m. on 2 August 1943. They received a message by radio about 9:30 in the morning on 2 August to be on the lookout for survivors of the PT-109. And this would be a very important aspect in terms of what happened. You'll see in this diagram that the 109's hulk is now drifting in what's Blackett Strait with survivors aboard. And morning comes, and the 109 survivors drifting with the hulk of the 109 decide that the 109 hulk is going to sink, and they decide they need to swim to a nearby island, but they don't want to swim to one that has Japanese on it. They sight a nearby very small island called Plum Pudding Island. The survivors are going to call Bird Island, and about 2 p.m. or 1400 hours, they strike out towards the small island. Kennedy again is towing the badly burned Mac Mahone, who has a life jacket on, and Kennedy has 2 threads which are through the life vest, and he puts them in his teeth and pulls and tows Mac Mahone towards the small island. He actually arrives there before the other survivors arrive. They have a couple of non-swimmers. They're all gripping this piece of wood and propel it towards the island, and they reach there on the island about 1800 hours or 6 p.m. That night, Kennedy decides that he's going to attempt to make contact with other PT boats to effect a rescue of his crewmen who are on Plum Pudding Island. He takes a life jacket and a lantern, and he swims out into Ferguson Passage, which is a passage that had been used by the PT boats on prior nights to get up to Blackett Strait. Unfortunately, this night, no PT boats come. The current in Blackett Strait catches Kennedy and starts to pull him out to the Solomon Sea. And basically, Kennedy eventually has to give up, that he's simply in the hands of the current and he's drifting. Miraculously, however, the current switches directions and starts sending Kennedy back towards the Ferguson Passage. And he eventually manages to get back there. And in a very exhausted state, he finally manages to swim back to Bird Island. The next night, August 2nd, 3rd, George Barney Ross, who is a supernumerary on the PT-109, he takes the orders from Kennedy to go out and try to make contact with PT boats. And he also has great difficulty, and he manages to get out there, but doesn't make any contact. There are no PT boats operating at that time. Now, on the 4th of August, the survivors who are without food or water on this Plum Pudding or Bird Island decide to make to the nearby larger island, which is Olasana, and once again they conduct a swim to get over there. And then that night, no one goes out to make contact with the PT boats. On the 5th, however, that afternoon, Kennedy and Ross attempt to explore Nauru or Gross Island, which you see indicated by the red arrow mark. Meanwhile, Evans has notified some of his scouts. The 2 that are important here are Baiku Agasa and Aroni Kamana, to be on the lookout for PT-109 survivors. And it so happens that these 2 scouts, who are very young Solomon Islanders, they're about 19 years old, and they get around by paddling a small boat here in the deep ocean, which shows you just exactly how wonderfully adapted they were to their environment. And they also happen to fetch up on Nauru Gross Island, and they actually sight Kennedy and Ross. However, the scouts believe that the 2 people that they see at a distance are probably Japanese, and they hop in their back in their boat and make away. Ross and Kennedy try to evade the scouts, which they believe might be Japanese also. Ironically, the scouts immediately head over to a nearby island at Gossa's urging, and they find the main body of the 109 survivors waiting there, and make a very joyous union with them at that time. The survivors are absolutely delighted to make contact with these friendly local Solomon Islanders. The 109 survivors have been gathered, and they're actually under Ensign Leonard Thom, who's the executive officer, or just below Kennedy on the 109, and he does yeoman work in rallying the survivors. Thom writes a written message, which he gives to the scouts and wants them to take back to make contact to arrange for a rescue. However, they all decide to stay overnight. At the same time, that night, Kennedy and Ross try to go out into Ferguson Passage again and are almost lost in storm-like conditions. When they finally manage to retrieve themselves, they make their way back to Olasana before midnight and make contact with the scouts and the main body of the 109 survivors. On the 6th of August, Kennedy is taken by the scouts to meet Evans. Meanwhile, Gassa and Kamana, they head off back to the PT boat base around Rendova, and they have both a written set of instructions from Thom and also famously a coconut which has been split open, and Kennedy has carved a message into it. And they're heading back towards making a rendezvous with the PT boat base. Ironically, that night, during the night of the 5th, 6th, the survivors of the 109 actually can see in the distance the light flashes, which represent a battle in Vela Gulf. And in that battle, 2 of the destroyers that had been involved in the action on the 1st and 2nd of August, the Arashi and the Hagakazi, are sunk. Just briefly, this is the written message that Thom drafts. It's quite detailed. It's very important because there's a lot of details in it that are going to convince Thomas Warfield, who's the commander of the PT boats, that it's authentic. They also carry this coconut, which has been carved with this message from Kennedy, and it sort of serves to double prove that the message is authentic, because actually, originally, Warfield is not inclined to think they're authentic. The story that has reached back to the PT boat base, which is relayed by PT 162, is that they saw the 109 rammed in this giant fireball, and they assumed that all the 109 crew members had been killed in the fire, and they report that all hands have been lost, which makes for some skepticism initially about whether there could have been any survivors. On the 7th, rescue mission is organized at the PT boat base. The PT boat 157 is going to be the pickup boat, and she's going to be accompanied initially by the PT 171, which has radar, which is going to help them navigate. And the 157 makes it to Olasana, where Kennedy and the rest of the survivors are waiting, and picks them up and pulls them out by 0215, 7 August. And then 157 boat heads back towards the PT boat base near Rendova. Of course, there's quite a joyous reunion when the PT boat survivors get back to the base. They had been assumed to be lost, and they're quite joyfully received at that time. And of course, they're quite thankful to the scouts. Notwithstanding this particular episode in which the 11 survivors are rescued, there's a Navy policy that if you're survivors of a sunken ship, you're entitled to 30 days leave. However, this means you have to travel back on that 30 days back to the States, do your leave, and come back within the 30 days and continue your tour until it's finished. Kennedy, like most of the other members of the 109 survivors, decides he's going to stay out and finish his tour. He gets command of another PT boat, the PT 59, which has been converted into a gunboat. They take out the torpedo tubes. They mount 2 40-millimeter Bofors guns and 10 50 caliber machine guns. And this is entitled to deal with Japanese barges or landing craft, which are being for logistical purposes in the Solomon Islanders. And Kennedy is in command from October to November 1943. During that time, on one occasion, he uses the 59 boat to rescue 10 stranded Marines before his tour finally ends. Now, the Navy comes to review what they should make of Kennedy's performance and the loss of the 109. And basically, they reach the judgment that there's nothing up to the moment where the 109 is sunk, which particularly reflects meritorious service. However, Kennedy's performance in life-saving with respect to going out swimming these very hazardous night swims in Ferguson Passage, and his other actions in terms of rallying the survivors deserves an award. And he receives the Navy Marine Corps Life-Saving Medal, which recognizes correctly the high point of his service with respect to his survivors. Kennedy later is going to be rotated back to the States after January 1944, and there he fortuitously meets the writer John Hershey at the Stork Club in New York City, and it tells part of his story. And Hershey is much taken by Kennedy's account of what had happened, particularly the very mysterious story of when he's out that one night. He's taken by the current out to sea and then back in Ferguson Passage. Hershey's going to write that up in a story which is going to be called Survival, which is going to be published in the New Yorker in June in 1944 and makes quite a splash. Kennedy's father, Joseph P. Kennedy, has an eye towards publicity towards his family, sees to it that a reprint of that is published in the Reader's Digest. It'd be more likely that Massachusetts voters are going to be reading the Reader's Digest than the New Yorker. Both Marnie and Kirksey are never seen again after the 109 is rammed. I learned in 2012 in meeting with a gentleman who was then the director of the U.S. National Memorial in Manila. I found out that the U.S. after World War II set up two national cemeteries in the Pacific Ocean areas. One is in Hawaii called the Punch Bowl. The second is located in Manila. The Solomon Islands were assigned to the Manila facility. And besides the remains of that were not repatriated after the war, that were buried at Manila, there's also a memorial section at the Manila National Cemetery that commemorates all of those who are missing or whose remains were never recovered. And after I went to look at that, I found that Marnie was carried as killed in action as of the date and time that the 109 was rammed and sunk, but Kirksey was carried as missing in action. And I asked the director, Bert Kalud, who I'd met, about why this disparity actually existed. And he explained that, well, it was well known among service members at that time that if you were carried as killed in action, your pay and benefits stopped as of the date of the day you were carried as killed in action. If you were carried as missing in action, your pay and benefits continued to be paid to your next of kin until such time as your status of missing in action ended. It automatically would extend for 1 year. At the end of 1 year, if there was no evidence of your survival, then the pay and benefits would stop. And as Bert explained, since this was well known in the services at that time, when they examined the situation with respect to Marnie and Kirksey, Marnie was single with no one but his parents as survivors. Kirksey was married with a wife and child. And although there's no documentation of that, as Bert pointed out, quite clearly they would have consulted the skipper, Kennedy, as to what status to put Kirksey in, and the status of missing in action was assigned to Kirksey, not to Marnie, which explains the difference in their status. And that also guaranteed that Kirksey's survivors, a wife and a child, would receive his pay and benefits until that 1 year period ended up. I should also ask, there was another element about this story, which is sort of a twist. Kirksey had been aboard the 109 when it was near missed by a bomb, and after that he had a strong foreboding sense that he was going to be killed. Kennedy, he made that very clear. Kennedy believed that he needed to transfer Kirksey off the boat. Kirksey was reluctant to go unless he was specifically ordered off the boat, and Kennedy had not gotten around to ordering him off the boat before that night. So there's that additional element of Kirksey that Kennedy, I believe, had some certain degree of sense of responsibility about Kirksey. The story that Survival is going to be published and republished many times because this particular story of Kennedy's survival, of the sinking of the 109 and his actions thereafter, are going to become a cornerstone of his campaigning in his remaining political life, both in Massachusetts and later when running for President of the United States. This last slide is a picture that was taken when I was in Blackett Strait, March 2012, which was part of an Australian-sponsored cruise at that time up through the Solomon Islands. And we stopped in Blackett Strait. I have to tell you that having looked at charts of the area, it never gives you a sense of how incredibly small and tiny that area appears to be when you're actually there. I met Ironi Kumana, who was one of the two scouts sent by Coast Watcher Evans to find the survivors of the 109. And I met him, and as you can see, I'm shaking hands with him on the ship I was on, right in Blackett Strait. If you look at that image carefully, you'll notice his enormous hands. This was 69 years after the event. He told me a story, however, which I found intriguing. He said that when he first saw the individual he later learned was Kennedy on Nauru Gross Island, at that time he thought, sighting him in the distance, as Ironi and his comrade were in this wrecked barge rummaging around, he thought that Kennedy was Japanese. And according to Aroni's story in 2012, he reached down, found a Japanese rifle, picked it up, and attempted to shoot Kennedy with the rifle, but the rifle would not fire. Now, as an attorney and a historian, I've had a lot of experience with witnesses, particularly remote memory. And the basic rule of thumb is that the longer you get after the event, the less credible the story of the individual is. I also have learned over the years that the human mind has this sort of default option, which it tends to operate in the sense that if it does remember you doing something, it usually puts you in either a neutral state or a favorable state. Normally, your memory does not remember well something that is going to redound to your discredit. So looking at that story told to me in 2012, I was not inclined to believe it. On the other hand, the fact that he was willing to admit that he took a rifle and tried to shoot John F. Kennedy struck me as being a rather remarkable story and, quite possibly true, although not probably true. I think still it's been a long time since 1943 that this story emerged. But in any event, it was quite fascinating to actually see these islands and see the place where this took place and realize that this is tiny. By oceanic standards, this is tiny. This is not merely a bathtub. This is like a bassinet in terms of the distances and location that these events took place in that we've talked about today. And with that, I want to thank you for your time and attention. And we have time now for some questions and hopefully my answers. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation. I think everybody else would agree that that was really, really fascinating. I'm going to start by asking you, do you think that at the time of the events, or rather shortly afterward, that this was the best news that Joseph Kennedy had ever received, in the sense that finally here was a truly heroic episode which he could turn to his advantage and might help achieve his great wish, which was for one of his sons to become the U.S. president? Did you, in your research, come across Joe Kennedy's reaction to the events in the Pacific?
Well, that's interesting. What happened was that the Joe Kennedy got notice, sort of informally, from the Navy Department that John was missing. And he did not share that with his wife, Rose, or anyone else. So it obviously went for more than a week with them being unclear as to what the status was with respect to John. And finally, they learned what had happened. And of course, they were overjoyed, to say the least. And as you say, Joseph P. Kennedy was always had an eye on the future political fortunes of his sons. He had a political career which had, should we say, sort of flamed out. And he was very anxious. And he put most of his hope, of course, on his older son, Joseph, who would be killed in August of 1944. And then John, his second son, stepped up to take the mantle on for the future of the family and politics. But yeah, the manipulation, it was quite a manipulation to get the Reader's Digest to publish survival. New Yorker articles were not standard fare in the Reader's Digest, to say the least, or whatever here. And he managed to get that published and then reprinted or whatever, and it became a fixture as a campaign booster. Everything that Kennedy ran thereafter. Let me just add something else about that. I mean, when I go to this story, I really feel connected with it in a couple of ways. One is that Kennedy was the first president who was really fully in my consciousness when I was about 13 or so, and I was completely smitten by him and in his life, even though, as we know, not everything was quite how it was presented at the time or whatever. But then I was in Vietnam, and I had experience as a junior combat leader there. And believe me, when you know what it's like to be on the spot in those circumstances, making decisions with people's lives in your hands over here, I can really connect with how Kennedy reacted after the 109 was sunk, and his sense of responsibility for his crewmen. And he was was courageous, he was stubborn. Maybe his judgment was not all that great in swimming out into Ferguson Passage. That may not have been the smartest thing to do, as opposed to trying to get yourself someplace where you could try to hail all the PT boats down from some. If he'd been out there with that lantern and flashing it, he might possibly have been machine gunned rather than rescued by the PT boat. So that, in retrospect, that was probably not the smartest thing to do, but it was damn brave.
I once came across a description of Joseph Kennedy that I can't help but not share with people. It's by a fellow Brit. It was after Kennedy had left London, where he was a spectacularly poor ambassador. And a Brit described Kennedy's father, Joe, as being more yellow than daffodils. So anyway, I had to throw that in because it's one of my favorite quotes about Kennedy Sr. But why is it that
Let me just add, Alex, I think that what you touched on was something that was extremely important.
Yeah.
Why John and Joseph were in service. I mean,
Yeah.
it was very explicit that there was to show the family wasn't, quote, yellow, unquote. I mean, that was a fundamental motivation, and getting out to the combat zone was part of that for John Kennedy.
Well, also, if you think about it, there's no way that you could run for serious senior political office unless you had played a part in World War II, unless you'd served your country. Imagine, being on the election hustings and saying, well, I can't really quite give you a good story about what I did in the war. Everybody had to have a story, didn't they?
Right, they did. The only, and you're exactly right, especially for the highest level positions, it was extremely difficult not to have had not only service, but typically overseas service. The only major exception to that was Hubert Humphrey, who was medically disqualified. And he's the only really major political figure I can think of that generation who did not have actual active duty service. I mean, even Reagan had some service in Hollywood over there. And of course, World War II veterans dominated the presidency, from 1960 well into the 1980s.
One of my theories about about post-war American politics is that most people, when they were in political combat, knew that the person they were talking to or running against was a fellow veteran or came from a generation that had put country above party, and therefore there was a kind of protocol or a politeness, a lack of partisanship that dominated American politics until we had candidates who had not served. I think that's an important point to make. I'm going to have to ask you this question, another question about Johnson, Kennedy's vice president. Tell us about his World War II service. I know it's a bit off topic, but do you think that Johnson created a kind of myth of his service in the Pacific? I think he was in the Pacific on an observation tour, and he turned that into some talk about making a legend. Johnson made it into an extraordinary fable. Tell us about Johnson's service as opposed to Kennedy.
Boy.
Sorry, I'm on a roll here.
To the right guy. Okay, I know about Johnson. Okay, well, here's the deal. He was a congressman, and there were a number of congressmen who immediately after Pearl Harbor rushed to go into active duty. Johnson was one of them. And Johnson hooked himself into this fact-finding trip, or whatever to call it. And he got out to the South Pacific. In fact, he got out to the Southwest Pacific, MacArthur's theater. And he signed on to go with at least one other member of the party he was with on this mission. It was a group of B-26 medium bombers who were going to go bomb a major Japanese base on New Guinea at Lae. Now, I have to emphasize that the faint of heart did not volunteer to go on a mission like that. Okay, so I'm going to be very clear that I'm not disparaging what Johnson had volunteered to do. But the fact was, by fate, his aircraft developed engine problems and had to turn back and land. It did not get to lay, did not encounter the Japanese. The planes that did go on included the plane that originally Johnson had been in, that he'd switched places with this other member of the party. That plane was shot down and everybody aboard was killed. Later on, Johnson chose to tell the story and at least have the story become public, that claiming that his plane had actually completed the mission to Leh and had been intercepted by Japanese aircraft. MacArthur, who had an eye for building the goodwill with political characters, he'd given Johnson a decoration. Actually, it was more of a, at the time it was given, well, I won't go there. It was different from what it seemed to be later, because Johnson was wearing the Silver Star thing or whatever here later. In any event, it certainly helped Johnson. And although, he did not do what he said he did, what he had volunteered to do, I wouldn't take any credit away for that at all.
Well, I looked into the episode, and it strikes me that this is one of the greatest pieces of fiction in resume building in American political history. I mean, Johnson went to town. I mean, this was his great. It was extraordinary. But anyway, people have criticized John Kennedy. There's been a lot of criticism that you're aware of, and have blamed him for what happened to PT 109. I mean, is there any substance to that at all, or is this just his political enemies having a go at Kennedy?
In military service, naval service, whatever we're going to call it, if you are the commander of a unit, down to a PT boat or a life raft for that matter, you bear full responsibility, whether things go right or go wrong, whether you directly contribute to things going right or going wrong, you are responsible, right? So the circumstances in which the PT 109 was rammed and sunk have always raised questions. I mean, no other PT boat in the entire war was rammed and sunk, only the 109. And certainly there are questions about what was the state of the watch on the 109 at the time. And at one time I thought that clearly Kennedy was clearly culpable for the state of the watch, not picking up Amagiri sooner. As I got to thinking after years of study and realizing this phenomena about the cloud banks of mists or whatever here, I mean, they played major roles in some of these battles, particularly the Battle of Savo Island or whatever here. And you see that story frequently in other encounters where you have these cloud banks, drifting in and out, like curtains being opened and closed or whatever. It restricts, if you're relying on visual contact or observation, those cloud banks can play hob with whatever's going on. So it's entirely possible that would explain what had happened and why Amagiri got as close as it did before anyone on the 109 was aware of its presence. But we'll never really know. But ultimately, there's no gainsaying the fact that they got rammed. They shouldn't have been rammed. They were the only boat that got rammed or whatever here, and that was basically that was at the feet of John F. Kennedy as skipper of the 109.
Had he had any other surname, would this have been a black mark against him?
Believe me, you could get a black mark whether you were a Kennedy or anybody else for some failure of duty or whatever. That was not. I don't think that was actually a large part of the people he served with did not realize he was a Kennedy of that Kennedy family or whatever. He didn't. Right. He didn't go around broadcasting that. Partly because being associated with Joseph P. Kennedy at that time was not exactly going to win friends and influence people by the time after Pearl Harbor.
So we have a statement from Tess. She says how lucky they were not to be captured by the Japanese. Can you respond to that?
Oh, yes, indeed. I mean, they were extremely conscious of the fact that they did not want to be captured. And that's why they made those choices about where to go. And once again, having been out there, I mean, Plum Pudding Island or Bird Island, the very first place they went, right? This little tiny, very tiny, when we were going through in 2012 on this Australian cruise ship, some entrepreneur had set up a bar on Plum Pudding Island, Blurt Island, with a landing, and they wanted to charge an exorbitant sum for people to come ashore from a cruise ship to have a drink on the island that Kennedy and the 109 survivors came to. The problem was the currents in Blackett Strait kept rearranging things. The island itself never entirely went away, but it was constantly being reshaped. And so this landing that they had erected to this bar was obviously not long for this world when we saw it. Plus the price was really high, so I didn't go ahead and partake of some brew on Plum Pudding Island. But yeah, that's where they stayed, to the smaller places. In fact, even when they got to Olasana, they kept in one small area because they were concerned about. And in the Solomons, you never knew for sure where you might run into some Japanese.
So we have a couple of statements here from Robert. Mr. Frank, congratulations on your definitive book on Guadalcanal, which is on the shelf behind me. We have another fan here, Kahuna. Another.
I can say that's a good American.
You can't see my bookshelves, but I do actually have your book. I actually have a couple of your books on my bookshelf too. So there you go. Anyway, another wonderful presentation by Rich Frank. Another one here from Lewis. Professor Frank, I always have my students read portions of your Tower of Skulls. Your scholarship is always wonderful. Were there assumptions you had going into your research on Kennedy and PT 109 that collapsed after your research?
Well, before I really made a deep dive into it, I mean, I knew a handful of things. First of all, that no other PT boat in the entire world was rammed and sunk, which seemed odd. And secondly, that, intuitively, just from knowing basically some basic ABCs about naval tactics, how the hell did this destroyer get so close to ram the PT 109? It seemed like there must be some defect of the watch being maintained on the 109. And after I studied it, I found, the evidence sort of divided up both ways. You can point to various things. Why exactly? I should point out that the PT boat base at Landova actually had a total of, I think it was 5 separate motor torpedo boat squadrons assigned. However, these were bits and pieces of them, and there were different standard operating procedures in different squadrons. And at least one of the squadrons had an absolutely rigorous standard operating procedure that when the boat was out on patrol, everybody had to be alert and on watch. But they were going out very frequently, and as I mentioned earlier in the talk, it's very exhausting duty, because when you got back from your night patrol, you had to one of the most arduous things, you had to refill 3,000-gallon tanks with 55-gallon drum containers. Think about the physical labor involved in arranging that. So one of the squadrons had a sort of an open-ended policy, and you could have some people off watch at times, which was looking towards, the long haul, having to go out night after night after night. So at the end of the day, though, I think we'll never know why it was that they didn't detect, but it's entirely possible that it's one of these cloud banks that really interfered with seeing the Armageddon until it was very close.
So final question, what light does this episode throw on Kennedy as a president? Anything that you learned from your research that helped explain better what kind of president he was?
Well, I would say, based on my own personal experience, being a junior combat leader teaches you at a very young age to know the weight of responsibility, particularly for the people who are immediately under you, but also it obviously applies when you're responsible for a lot more people. It gives you a sense of gravitas about the nature of what you're doing. You don't get typically in civilian life. Some people do, but you definitely get it when you operate as a junior leader in a combat situation. It also one of the other things it teaches you is that you you know you have to make decisions, and you know you have to make decisions when you don't remotely have all the information you'd like to have. But when you get to a moment where you know you've got to decide right now, you know what those moments are like.
Well, thank you, Rich, for a fantastic presentation. On behalf of friends, I want to wish you a great weekend. Please rejoin us. You're a fantastic historian, and long may you keep putting out these amazing books. Everybody has been very, very happy today with what you've done for us today.
Thank you very much, Alex. It's a great pleasure.
Our pleasure.